Good afternoon, and welcome to the 24th Annual Library of Congress National Book Festival, a place where books build us up. I am Beatriz Raspo, Head of Logistics of the Library of Congress National Library Services for the Blind and Print Disabled. It is a pleasure, and I'm very happy to introduce Max Boot, a historian, best-selling author, and foreign policy analyst. He is the Jean J. Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow for National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a weekly columnist at the Washington Post. His new biography is titled Reagan, His Life and Legend. He will be in conversation with David N. Rubenstein, who is the co-chair of the National Book Festival and an original signer of the Giving Pledge. He's also a recipient of the Carnegie Medal of Philanthropy and the Museum of Modern Art's David Rockefeller Award. His latest book, The Highest Calling, Conversations on the American Presidency, is featured at this year's festival. I hope you enjoy the festival, and let's welcome them to our stage.
So I enjoyed reading your book. How long did it take you to write the book?
10 years.
The Reagan administration was 8 years, so it took you 2 years longer to write the book than the Reagan administration lasted. Is that right?
It was not a fly-by-night project. I think you can say that for sure.
So was the family cooperating with you in any way?
Yeah, I mean, primarily Patty and Ron, two of the kids, were very cooperative and very helpful, and actually read the book already and gave it a thumbs up that I was very happy to see.
Really? Okay. So Ronald Reagan is somebody that was very worried about his own legacy in some respects, or maybe his family was, and so he had a biographer, Edmund Morris, who for the last year and a half or so was embedded into the Reagan White House and administration,
right,
supposed to write a biography of Reagan. Whatever happened to that? Why did that not work?
Well, Edmund Morris had unprecedented access to the Reagan administration, and I think you can say he basically blew it and produced a volume that had some interesting research in it and was well written in parts, but it was basically, to use the word of the hour, it was kind of deeply weird because he inserted himself into Reagan's life as a fictional character, and that kind of compromised the historical integrity of the entire project.
So what is the biggest surprise to you about Ronald Reagan that you learned as a result of doing all the research?
I think the biggest surprise was that Reagan was actually more pragmatic than people realize, and because his reputation is being that of a conservative firebrand, an ideologue, and he was very ideological, and I show in the book that in some ways he was actually probably more ideological than a lot of people realized, repeating some conspiracy theories and some outlandish rhetoric, especially in the early 60s. But the surprise about Reagan was that he didn't act on that sometimes extreme campaign rhetoric when he became governor of California in 1967, or when he became president of the United States in 1981. He actually veered to the center, as signing more tax increases than tax cuts. As governor of California, he signed the most liberal abortion law in the country and one of the toughest gun control bills in the country. And as he was able to work with Democrats, whether it was Jesse Unruh, the powerful Speaker of the California Assembly, or Tip O'Neill, the powerful Speaker of the U.S. House. And then at the end of his presidency, he was also able to work with Mikhail Gorbachev, which in some ways was the biggest surprise of all, because here was Ronald Reagan, who had spent his entire political life as a staunch anti-communist, as a critic of détente, calling out the quote-unquote evil empire, and yet he decided that Gorbachev was somebody he could do business with and actually became very friendly with, and together they worked together to end the Cold War. That is not something I think anybody would have expected of a hardline conservative like Ronald Reagan.
Now, many people who come to power in Washington are obsessed with it as young men or women. He didn't seem to be particularly obsessed with Washington or political life. How did he go from being a radio announcer in Iowa to an actor, and why was he considered a B actor? Why wasn't he an A actor?
Well, in some ways, the key event of Ronald Reagan's life occurred in 1932 when a new Montgomery Ward was opening up in Dixon, Illinois, his hometown. and they were advertising for somebody to run their sporting goods department for $12.50 a week. And you know, $12.50 a week at the height of the Depression, Ronald Reagan had just graduated from Eureka College, didn't have any job prospects, so he actually applied for that job. And as a former high school athlete, he might have gotten it. And if he had gotten that job in 1932, that's probably the last anybody would have ever heard of Ronald Reagan. He probably would have spent his whole life in Dixon. But unluckily for him, or luckily for us, he didn't get that job. Another guy got it. And so Ronald Reagan had to look elsewhere for a job in the midst of the Great Depression, and he got into radio, improbably enough, in Davenport, Iowa, and then in Des Moines, and he became a very successful sportscaster, well known throughout the Midwest for calling Chicago Cubs games, among others. And then in 1937, but he always had that desire at the back of his mind to get into acting, because he had been an actor in high school and in college. It was something he enjoyed. He was imbued with that love of acting by his mother, who was kind of a failed and frustrated thespian. And so in 1937, he convinced his bosses at the radio station in Des Moines to send him with the Cubs on spring training to Catalina Island off the coast of Southern California. And while he was he did one of his stints with the Cubs doing spring training, he went out to Hollywood and got a screen test with Warner Brothers. And then he thought nothing was going to come of it, and they didn't say that we were going to hire you, and so he went back to Des Moines assuming that nothing would ever happen. And then he got a telegram saying, "You're hired." And so in 1937, he picks up and moves from the Midwest to Hollywood, and he becomes, starts off as a B-movie actor, one of many minor, role players in the Warner stable. But by the eve of World War II rather, he was becoming, a pretty good star for them. Only, a notch or two below Errol Flynn.
And in those days, he became the head of the Screen Actors Guild, and he was known as a FDR liberal Democrat. What converted him from being an FDR liberal Democrat to being a conservative Republican?
Well, that's a great question, and that's another one of these myths that I think the book punctures, because the myth, which he created himself, he often said this a million times, I didn't desert my party deserted me, to suggest that the Democratic Party had gone far off to the left, and so he had to become a Republican. But the reality is, he went to the right in the 1950s and early 60s, when the Democratic Party was pretty centrist. There was the party of Sam Rayburn, Lyndon Johnson, John F. Kennedy. These guys were not some crazy left-wingers. They were, standing up to the Soviets and the Cuban Missile Crisis, sending troops to Vietnam. They were actually pretty hawkish, pretty centrist. So it wasn't the Democratic Party changing. It was really Ronald Reagan changing and moving to the right. And there were a variety of reasons for that, including, his battles with what he thought was resisting what he thought was a communist takeover of Hollywood in the late 40s, which I think was vastly exaggerated, but that's what his FBI contacts and others were telling him. He was also aggrieved because he had to pay such high taxes during World War II when, top rates were up to 90% or something, and he was making a lot of money. He didn't like that. He didn't like that the federal government filed an antitrust decree which broke up the studio system, so studios could no longer own movie theaters, and as a result of that, he became an unemployed actor. He was pushed out of Warner Brothers. And then finally, I think the final piece of the puzzle was that he went to work for General Electric, and that was really how he revived his career as a pitchman for General Electric in the 1950s. And GE was actually a very right-wing corporation. Its executives compared its ideology to that of the John Birch Society, and they actively proselytized their employees. And so as an employee of GE, he got all this conservative literature to read, and he had a lot of time to read it because he hated to fly, and so he would take the cross-country train from LA to New York, and he would be reading all these right-wing books and periodicals, and he basically converted himself through that process.
All right, so his career kind of came to a dormant phase. He wasn't really getting that many acting roles, and I think his agent got him a job as a MC, more or less, in Las Vegas to introduce some acts and so forth. Right. But what led him to run for governor of California? Where did he get that idea?
Well, he was developing political ambitions as he became more political and as his acting career waned. And then he assumed a pretty high-profile role in 1964 as a leading spokesman for Barry Goldwater. And in fact, towards the end of the campaign, he gave this famous speech that was televised nationally called A Time for Choosing speech, which was this electrifying debut on the national stage. And a lot of Republicans, when they were listening to Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater speak on the same platform, they said, gosh, I wish Goldwater spoke as well as Reagan, because, you know, Goldwater was, as I'm sure you remember, was very hard-edged. He was not a warm and cuddly guy. He knew what he believed and he was going to shove it down your throat. Whereas Reagan, as a journalist said in the mid-1960s, his personality was like warm bathwater. It was soothing. He could repeat the same message as Goldwater, but he could deliver it with a smile. He could make people like him and not feel threatened by him. And so after, you know, the Goldwater campaign, he started, you know, looking at running himself. And he thought that in 1966, Pat Brown, father of Jerry Brown, who was the two-term governor of California, he thought Pat Brown's popularity was waning and that Pat Brown would be vulnerable to a challenge. And in fact, that turned out to be very accurate because he beat Pat Brown by 1 million votes.
So he won in 1966, and in 1968 he makes a short campaign for president, trying to beat the presumed nominee, Richard Nixon. Was that a half-hearted effort? Did he really think he could be president after just 2 years as governor?
It was somewhat half-hearted for sure, but he did declare himself. He did try to run. He did go around the country trying to stump up votes, but then when he lost, and it didn't even come close, he basically pretended it had never happened. He kind of went down the memory hole, and he denied ever having really run for president in 1968 and said it was just like a few over-fervent supporters. And I talked to one of his aides, and he said, I was shocked. I mean, Reagan and I were on the campaign plane together with going around the country trying to get votes. How could he forget that this happened? But he tended to rewrite history the way he wanted it to be, not the way it actually happened.
So he serves 2 terms as governor, and then he decides to run for president again in 1976 against the incumbent Republican Gerald Ford, and he came very close to beating him. Did he expect he would actually have a chance to beat Ford? And how come he didn't actually get the nomination, though he came close?
He did expect to beat Ford. I mean, what was really in Reagan's mind was he thought that in 1976, Richard Nixon would be completing a second term of office and leaving office, and he thought that Ronald Reagan, would be the natural successor to Dick Nixon. And so he was a staunch Nixon supporter, never imagined that Nixon would be forced to resign because of Watergate. And so he was shocked when Ford became president, and he did not have a lot of respect for Jerry Ford. He viewed Ford as kind of an accidental president. He thought the job should really be his. And of course, Jerry Ford didn't have a lot of respect for Ronald Reagan either. And so that set up this bruising primary battle, which went almost all the way to the convention. And Reagan actually came pretty close. But you know, he also came close to a very humiliating defeat. And if he had lost the South Carolina primary, he probably would have been out of the race early on and may not have been able to run again in 1980. But he was saved in the South Carolina primary by Jesse Helms and his political machine. North Carolina, sorry, by Jesse Helms and his political machine. And so as a result of that, he then did very well in the South and came very close to Ford.
Okay, so he said to Ford at the convention in 1976, I support you, I'm going to campaign for you. Did Ford get a lot of support from Reagan in that campaign?
He got some. I wouldn't say a lot. Ford was kind of aggrieved afterwards that he thought that Reagan didn't do enough for him.
Okay, so Carter is president, and Reagan, is he deciding he's going to run for president again, regardless of how Carter performs, or he didn't like how Carter was doing and he energized his campaign in, let's say, 78, 80, 79?
I think he was looking to run. I probably had not made a decision right away, but that was kind of surprising because, you know, he was getting into his 70s at that point, and not a lot of people thought that he would be running, you know, at an advanced age. But he was convinced he could do it. And then, of course, once Carter, you know, ran into all of his problems with the Iran hostage crisis, with the economic woes, that created a massive opening. And so a lot of Republicans were lining up to run against Carter.
Reagan was 69 when he was running,
yeah.
An age that was then considered old, now be young to be president,
Yes.
right?
He'd be way too young to be president these days.
Too young to be president. So when he was running in 1980 against Carter, it was widely thought that Reagan was a nice guy, but not that substantive. And it was thought that maybe if he had Ford as vice president, Ford could give him some experience. And whose idea was that? And was that Ford pushing that idea? Or was it Reagan's idea? And why did it not actually happen?
I think it was a lot of Republicans pushing that idea who were kind of nervous about Reagan and didn't think that he was really up to the job. And so it was really people like Henry Kissinger and Alan Greenspan who were close to Ford, who I think were the primary movers and shakers behind that. And it actually came pretty close to happening, but then it kind of fell apart at the last minute when, on the floor of the convention, Walter Cronkite was interviewing Gerald Ford, and Cronkite said, well, so if you're the running mate, this will be kind of a co-presidency, right? And Ford sort of agreed with that. And Reagan was watching this in his hotel suite, and he was shocked because he wasn't signing up for a co-presidency. And so that was pretty much the end of that.
So then why did he call George Herbert Walker Bush, who had called his economic program voodoo economics, why did he offer him the vice presidency?
Well, because Reagan was the ultimate pragmatist, and he wanted to do what was necessary to be successful. And his aides were telling him that after Ford, Bush was by far the best choice to unify the party and reassure people about Reagan, because Bush had, Washington experience that Reagan lacked. So he was not, he was willing to put ideology and litmus test aside and do what he thought gave him the best chance of winning, and that was it.
So he gets the nomination, he brings Bush in as his vice president. He has one debate with Carter the week before the election, right, and he is seen as having won that debate.
There you go again.
Now, the famous line, "There you go again," what he was saying, as I recall, was something that Carter had said, but what Carter had said, it turns out, was actually factually accurate.
Yes,
was it not?
It was. I mean, I write about this in the book. It's kind of amazing because "there you go again" was one of these killer lines because it fed into this popular conception at the time that the media was feeding that Carter was kind of mean, because Carter had this reputation for being kind of a goody-goody, but the media was trying to get across that no, he was actually had this mean streak. And so Reagan was kind of playing off of that, because on the debate stage, Carter said, Governor Reagan opposed Medicare, which was true. He did oppose Medicare. Not only did he oppose Medicare and Medicaid, he said that they were socialized medicine, and passing Medicare and Medicaid would lead to the total loss of all freedom in the United States. I mean, that is a documented fact that he said all of that. But what Reagan's killer reply was, "There you go again," and then he denied that he had opposed Medicaid, saying that he had supported an alternative bill that was just as good, which was not true, because the alternative bill would have covered about 1 or 2% of seniors in this country, not all of them. So it was completely false, and yet he got away with it. And it was a great line. It was a killer line that is remembered today.
So Reagan won overwhelming election. And why did he pick Jim Baker, who had not been part of his club, close supporters in California, was not really that well known to Reagan? Why did he pick Jim Baker to be his chief of staff?
Well, in some ways, picking Jim Baker, I would argue, was the most important decision of his entire presidency. And it was a sign, again, like picking Baker's best friend, George Bush, as vice president. Again, it was a sign of how pragmatic Reagan was, because, as you said, Baker had no relationship with Reagan, and far from having a relationship with him, he had worked against Reagan twice, in '76 and '80, to try to deny him the nomination. And normally, presidents do not appoint their opponent's campaign manager as their White House chief of staff. And so the assumption was he was going to appoint Ed Meese, who was his chief of staff in Sacramento. But Mike Deaver and Stu Spencer, two Reagan aides, realized that Meese was not organized enough, didn't understand Washington enough, was not effective enough to be an effective White House chief of staff. And so they went to Nancy Reagan and they went to Ronald Reagan and said, no, I think you really should see how you like this Jim Baker guy. And Reagan got along with Baker and shocked the world by creating this troika of officials with Baker as White House chief of staff. And very quickly, he became by far the most powerful official, and in some ways the prime minister of the United States. And he was really responsible for a lot of the success of the first term, I would argue.
What was the nature of the Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan relationship? Intensely close marriage, and did he rely on her for personnel advice and things like that?
It was a wonderful love story, and sitting at the Reagan Library, I could go through box after box of letters and of holiday cards that Ronald Reagan sent to Nancy Reagan. Every Valentine's Day, every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every New Year's, how much he loved her. Very, very sweet to read. And when she was away for even a few days, he would be writing in his diary about how desperately he missed her. And so they had a very close bond. But it wasn't, and of course their marriage was primarily about love, and in a way that almost made even their kids feel like they were left out, because she was really his top priority. But she was also a very effective political partner for him, although she did not, and I want to again, this is another myth. Some people suggest that she pushed him to the right or she pushed him into politics. Neither of that is true. As far as I can tell, Nancy didn't really have any political beliefs. She didn't really have much political ambition. But what she wanted was whatever was the best for her Ronnie. And she understood that her husband wanted to be in politics, and so she was going to make that as successful as possible. And she was, she was kind of, as one of his aides described her to me, as kind of the chief personnel officer of Reagan Inc., because she would hire and fire. She was very suspicious. She would look out for his interests, where he was so optimistic, sunny, almost Pollyannish, that he never imagined anybody could be doing anything wrong, whereas she always assumed that somebody was doing something wrong and would ferret it out.
So what would you say is the biggest accomplishment he had in his first 4 years as president?
Well, I think the biggest accomplishment in his first 4 years was probably, reviving the economy, and the armed forces. Although on the economy side, I think you have to say that Paul Volcker probably deserved more credit than Reagan, because it was Volcker who, took the inflation out of the economy, and that allowed the economic rebound in 1984. But, I think that Reagan did play an important role in kind of reviving people's spirits and reviving their faith in America after all the turmoil and troubles of the 1970s.
So Reagan was going to run for re-election. He's running for re-election at the age of, I guess he was 73 or 4 when he was running for re-election.
Yeah.
So he's running against Mondale. He thought he was going to run against Mondale. Mondale got the nomination after beating off Gary Hart. Why did that election turn out to be such a landslide?
Well, because Reagan could plausibly proclaim it was morning in America, because he got very lucky that the very severe recession that hit the country from 81 to 83 was over, and we were entering a very strong period of economic recovery. I think the economic growth rate in 1984 was something like 7%, and of course it declined in the next few years, but it hit this post-recession high, and he was basically able to take advantage of that. And he pulled U.S. troops out of Lebanon after the disastrous bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983, so we weren't involved in any wars anywhere, and he could plausibly argue that he had brought back peace and prosperity.
And he has a debate with Mondale in that campaign where he has another famous line, which also you could say is a little disingenuous in some respects. And what was that famous line?
Well, there were two, he had these two debates with Mondale. And the first one, he really screwed up, not as badly as, Biden screwed up, but he screwed up. And there was a lot of talk that he was too old and he was out of it and he couldn't be president and all that kind of stuff. And so that was, in the second debate, he got a question about age, where the Baltimore Sun correspondent tried to approach the age issue delicately by saying, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy had to go without sleep for 20 hours at a time. Could you do that at your age, Mr. President? And, Reagan got a little smile on his face and said, I will not use for political purposes my opponent's age and inexperience against him. And that was brought down the House, and even Walter Mondale had to laugh, and he was later admitted that even as he was laughing, he was understanding that the election was over in that very instant.
Right. So many second terms have problems, and the principal problem in the second term of Reagan was Iran-Contra. What was that, and how did Reagan manage to escape that problem?
Well, I think the real problem in the second term began when Jim Baker, the White House Chief of Staff, and Don Regan, the Treasury Secretary, decided it would be a good idea for them to switch jobs. And they presented this as almost a fait accompli to Reagan in a half-an-hour Oval Office meeting. He said, okay, sure, whatever. And so they did, and this turned out to be a disaster, because Don Regan was a horrible White House Chief of Staff. As Jim Baker said to me, Don liked the chief part of the title, but he didn't understand that he was staff. He wanted to be the CEO of the United States because he'd been CEO of Merrill Lynch before, and he didn't have good political instincts. And as a result of that, things kind of went haywire in the Iran-Contra affair, which was an initiative started by Reagan's National Security Advisor, Bud McFarlane, to try to get hostages held by the Iranians free. And this was something, their fate of the hostages was something that really anguished Reagan. He really was desperately worried. He wanted them home. And so Bud McFarlane got this bright idea of selling weapons to Iran to get the hostages released. And it worked for a little bit, but then the Iranians kept taking more hostages. So at the end of the day, it wasn't actually working. But then McFarlane's successor as National Security Advisor, John Poindexter, and his aide, Oliver North, got another bright idea, which was to divert the profits from the sale of arms to Iran to support the Nicaraguan Contras, the guerrilla fighters, even though Congress had forbidden the government from supporting the Contras. And so this was in violation of what was known as the Boland Amendment. And that is something that could have potentially gotten Reagan impeached, except that Poindexter said he never told Reagan. And so that was basically what saved Reagan's presidency, because he could plead ignorance of the diversion of funds to the Contras.
Well, Reagan was generally thought not to be paying much attention to details, so he could credibly say, I didn't really understand
No,
what was
exactly.
going on.
No, you could argue that he got into the Iran-Contra. I mean, I think big picture, Ronald Reagan, great leader, but a poor manager, very hands-off manager, often didn't know what his aides were doing. And so you could argue that the reason he got into the Iran-Contra affair in the first place was because he was a very poor hands-off manager. But the reason he survived the Iran-Contra affair was also because he was a very poor hands-off manager, because, you know, if Dick Nixon had said, I had no idea about the diversion, nobody would have believed him. But when Ronald Reagan said it was plausible.
So toward the end of the administration, there's a decision about who's going to be the next president, and his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, is running for the nomination, but it wasn't given to him. And why did Reagan not endorse him right away? He's been serving loyally for 8 years. Why did he not endorse him?
He had some reservations. Well, first off, I would say that they were not particularly close. You know, the Bushes were never invited to the family quarters in 8 years of the Reagan presidency. Barbara Bush and Nancy Reagan really loathed one another. You know, George and Ron got along better, but they were not certainly close personal friends. And I think, you know, Reagan harbored some doubts as to whether Bush was a skillful enough politician, whether he was tough enough to actually win the presidency. And so he was not going to short circuit the primary process. He did not endorse Bush until it was apparent he was going to be the nominee.
It is said that when they first got together and were going to run in the 1980 convention, that Mrs. Reagan said to Mrs. Bush, you know, you should lose some weight and dye your hair. Any truth to that?
It's plausible. I don't know, but it's
Okay.
plausible. They certainly did not get along.
Okay.
It was kind of interesting because, again, Nancy Reagan was a very different personality type from her husband, and her husband got along well with pretty much everybody, including George Bush, including Mikhail Gorbachev. But Nancy had these famous feuds with Barbara Bush as well as with Raisa Gorbachev.
So, is there any evidence that there was that Reagan had Alzheimer's towards the end of his administration, or did that come subsequent?
Well, the diagnosis certainly came subsequently. The hard question to answer is, did he have Alzheimer's when he was already in office? And I actually asked one of his Alzheimer's doctors that very question. And the answer I got was that he certainly had the precursors of Alzheimer's, the plaques and the whorls that cause Alzheimer's. Those were certainly present in his brain when he was president, but that doesn't mean that he had dementia. And I would say the evidence suggests he did not. I mean, if you look at the handwriting, for example, in his diary, it was pretty clear and legible from the beginning to the end of his presidency. But there was, you know, you could tell there was a natural slowing down in his second term as he was getting up well into his 70s, and his aides noticed that he was not as involved in his second term in doing things like rewriting speeches and other things that he had done much more of in his first term. He was slowing down, but it's almost impossible to distinguish the impact of, at a very early stage, the impact of Alzheimer's from just the normal aging process of somebody who's in their late 70s, who almost died in 1981, was shot, lost a lot of blood, so he'd been through a lot.
I forgot to go through that. In March of his first year in office, he's shot by John Hinckley. And at the time, people said, well, he wasn't coming close to death. It was okay, not a big problem. But now we know that he came very close to death. Is that right?
He did, but it was really, I titled the chapter on the shooting, Finest Hour, because it was really his finest hour. And that was when he really cemented his bond with the American people, because he showed unbelievable grace in the most adverse circumstances. As he was literally at death's door, he was joking around. He was telling Nancy Reagan, honey, I forgot to duck. He was telling his doctors as they were about to operate on him, I hope you're all Republicans. You know, when people heard that, I think it established kind of a personal bond between the president and the public that had not been there before.
Now, when he left office, he was criticized for making too much money in some speeches and so forth. But
$2 million in speeches in Japan, which seemed like a lot of money at the time.
Was a lot then. Today, what would you say is the main thing he did post-president was to get his library off the ground, and now the most popular presidential library. What would you say he accomplished, if anything, post-president?
Well, he didn't have a lot of time post-presidency because he left the presidency in 1989. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 1994. And I think, you know, his real accomplishment post-presidency wasn't anything he did. It was what happened in the world because, you know, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed, and a lot of people gave him a lot of credit for that. So his historical record, you know, went up dramatically after he left office.
So he was considered very conservative when he came on the political scene, but today in the Republican Party, would he be considered a moderate or a centrist or not conservative enough?
Well, I think today he would probably be considered a rhino, Republican in name only. I mean, remember, this was a guy who, you know, in 1986 signed the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, which legalized millions of undocumented immigrants. It was what would today be called an amnesty bill, and that was something he signed. He also advocated eliminating the border between the U.S. and Mexico and creating what became known as the North American Free Trade Agreement. These are all things that are anathema, I think, to most Republicans today.
Reagan had 4 children. With his first wife, Jane Wyman, he had a daughter. Then he had an adopted son with Jane Wyman, and then he had 2 children with Nancy Reagan.
Right.
What was his relationship with those 4 children?
It was pretty distant because he really had a distant relationship with almost everybody except for Nancy. I mean, I talked to his kids about that, and their view is they liked him, and they still like him. He was a very genial, likable guy, just like he was on the campaign trail. But they didn't see a lot of him because, you know, a lot of the time in the 50s and early 60s, he was out touring the country on behalf of GE. And so then he would come home for a weekend, and they would go out to his ranch, which in those days was located in Malibu, and they would really enjoy hanging out with their dad. But then he would leave again. It would really be Nancy who was raising them. And he was also, by the way, very conflict averse. He didn't really want to dig deep into personality conflicts. He wanted to avoid them as much as possible. And so he often didn't know what was really going on with, he kind of wanted to avoid the hard conversations, I guess I would say. So he often didn't really know what was going on with his kids, even when, you know, Maureen had an abusive first husband, or Patty was struggling with some addiction issues, or, you know, Michael, as he later revealed, had been molested as a boy. These were all things that Ronald Reagan didn't learn until many decades after the fact.
So Reagan had a better situation than you or I with respect to hair. He had a lot of dark hair. Was that dark
Can't
hair?
deny that.
Was that dyed, or was that just natural?
Well, he always denied a dye job, but I think there was some suspicion that he wasn't being entirely forthcoming there, that Kitty Kelly certainly argued that Nancy Reagan's stylist had been secretly touching up his hair, but I think he did have pretty naturally, you know, dark hair.
So what would you like most people to remember about Ronald Reagan?
Well, I think that I'd like them to remember that he was a complicated personality, that, you know, he was often accused of having simplistic views, but he certainly was not a simple man, and there was a lot more to him than it appeared to be on the surface, including things like I just pointed out, the fact that he was so conflict averse in person, which you would not expect from somebody who said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. So he could be very confrontational politically, but not very confrontational in his personal life. And that's, you know, he was actually, in many ways, kind of a shy, introverted person who his idea of a good time was sitting in front of the TV watching Bonanza. He didn't want to hobnob with people. He wanted to read. He wanted to be by himself. As Stu Spencer, his longtime political consultant, said, he would have made a pretty good hermit, which you would not expect from somebody who was seemingly so gregarious and outgoing. So the bottom line is, I think there was a lot more to Ronald Reagan than meets the eye.
So we've just covered your entire book in 30 minutes.
An amazing achievement. You are a great interviewer, David.
Why should somebody want to buy and read this book now, having heard everything? I assume there's a good reason why somebody should buy it. Why don't you give us that reason before we have questions from our audience?
Well, I think, although you have done an amazing job of covering a lot of ground in 30 minutes, I can just say, I can attest that there's a lot more in this 800-page book, and I think it's a pretty good and pretty interesting story.
Look, I actually read the book, of course, and I read, I think, every major Reagan biography. I enjoyed it. You had a lot of things in there I didn't know, and I highly recommend it for anybody that wants to know more about that president. So, who has questions? Stand up here and just ask a question, hopefully not a statement.
No. He appointed Sandra Day O'Connor as first female on the Supreme Court. Was that to cement a legacy or set a history, or what was the thinking behind that whole process?
The thinking was that in 1980, he had a gender gap. He was doing much better with men than with women. And you know, Stu Spencer suggested to him that one way to rectify that would be to promise to appoint a woman to the Supreme Court, which he did. And then there was, you know, some right-wing opposition to Sandra Day O'Connor. There were, some hardcore anti-abortion activists were opposed to her nomination because they thought, and rightly as it turned out, that she would not overturn Roe v. Wade. But Reagan didn't really care. That wasn't really his obsession. And so he mainly just cared about having a justice who would be tough on crime and would not release criminals. And so he met, Sandra Day O'Connor, loved talking with her about her time on growing up on a ranch and riding horses. Those were his passions. And so, it was a done deal once he met Sandra Day O'Connor.
Thank you.
So Reagan, as a communicator, he had those radio speeches before he got into office, Time for Choosing, the Challenger speech. Part of his success was probably his voice and his presence, but also maybe the ideas. So how much of that was him, and how much of that was his speech writers?
Well, he certainly had very skillful speechwriters, but I would point out to you that Ronald Reagan was a very expert speech giver long before he had any speechwriters back in the 50s and 60s when he was writing his own speeches. And he would, he had these index cards, and he was always writing these index cards. And basically, his school of politics was working for General Electric because he went from plant to plant all across the country, and he had to basically give a stump speech. And he would often speak about not just the company issues, but also about political issues. And he was always writing down facts or things that he thought were facts or quotes. And he would shuffle his cards around and give his speeches. And, again, Stu Spencer, who I keep citing because he was one of my best interviews, and somebody who knew Reagan better than just about anybody going back to the 1960s. And Stu is one of the great political consultants in history, even though, he's not on TV, hasn't written a book. But Stu said to me, Reagan was one of the best speechwriter he ever met. Not just the best speech giver, but also the best speechwriter, because having grown up working in radio in his 20s, he understood how to write for the way that people hear, not for the way that they read, but for the way that they hear. And so he was brilliant at communicating orally, whether speeches, radio, television. He was damn good at all of that.
Thanks.
Okay.
So what lessons from Reagan's presidency should America pay attention to today?
Gosh, well, there's a lot of them. I mean, I think one big lesson is the need for, inspirational and optimistic leadership, because that was essentially who Ronald Reagan was, and that was a large part of his success, was the way that, he saw America as a shining city on a hill and kind of inspired Americans after some of the disasters and defeats of the 1970s. And so I think he shows why it's so important for the president to be an effective and inspirational communicator. But also, as we were discussing, I think the Reagan presidency also offers a cautionary tale about what happens if the president is too hands-off in his management style and doesn't actually know what's going on throughout the government, because there were a lot of scandals, including, for example, at HUD and other departments, that he was completely unaware of. And there were, he got the big things right, especially relations with the Soviet Union, but there were also a lot of other disasters, like we mentioned, in Lebanon, things that did not work out so well because he was not really attuned to those issues. He was not really involved in the nitty-gritty. And there was also an awful lot of personality conflicts in his administration, and often, especially between Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger and Secretary of State George Shultz. Those guys couldn't stand one another, and they were constantly going at it, and he would not sort out their disagreements. And so the result was often kind of a policy muddle that didn't satisfy anybody. So I think, the positive lesson from the Reagan presidency is how important it is to have this president who communicates so clearly, effectively, and inspirationally. But again, the cautionary tale is that the president also needs to be able to manage the government.
Thank you.
Here.
Great, thank you. At the risk of just going over stuff that you've already gone over a lot, I would like to dig back into the kind of the rightward drift of Ronald Reagan through the 50s and 60s, from a person who was not only a Democrat but a union person, and he must have had some fairly strong Democratic-leaning beliefs in those years, and so he had to get rid of them somehow. And you mentioned, of course, the huge influence of the GE time, but he was also somewhat beholden, I guess, to GE because they'd given him work. So,
oh yeah, I mean,
are there any other sort of sources of information or influence that would help explain that? And did he get mostly a sort of economic view of conservatism from GE versus a social political view, or both?
Probably some of both, but more on the economic side. I would say he became a staunch anti-communist in the years after World War II when he was at the Screen Actors Guild. And again, he battled what he thought was this communist takeover of Hollywood, but in fact was really just a standard labor dispute between one union that was mobbed up and in bed with the studios and another one that was more radical and you know was smeared as a quote unquote red union. And he believed that was something that the FBI was telling him and others were telling him. So he became an ardent anti-communist in the late 40s, early 50s in Hollywood, but I think he became more of an economic conservative in the 1950s as a result of his work for GE, where he was reading Human Events, he was reading National Review, he was reading all these, you know, Hayek and all these other authors that were recommended by GE. And so by the early 1960s, he was pretty far to the right for somebody who had described himself in the 1930s as an ardent New Dealer whose hero was Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Right. Thanks.
On the Nixon tapes, Reagan was caught in conversation with President Nixon using some very derogatory slurs, bigoted language. He also, correct me if I'm wrong, opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. What insights do you have about Ronald Reagan's views on race and race relations?
Well, Reagan always said, I am just plain incapable of prejudice, and he always cited the fact that his parents taught him not to be bigoted, and I think there is a lot of truth to that. But I think and it's certainly true that, you know, when you talk to his kids, they will tell you that he raised them to avoid bigotry. But I think it's also true that he had a long political record of utilizing white backlash politics for his own political advantage. I mean, he became governor in 1966 in part by running on this backlash against the Watts riots, which terrified people, and also opposing the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which was this law in California prohibiting discrimination in the sale or rental of housing. And as you rightly said, he opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He opposed the 1965 Voting Rights Act. He regularly played to white backlash politics with coded appeals, talking about law and order, talking about welfare queens. In 1980, he infamously went to a state fair in Mississippi and talked about states' rights near a site where in 1964, 3 civil rights workers had been slain. So he did have, and the slur that you referred to on the Nixon library tape, I think was probably an aberration. I certainly asked people who knew him very well, and I think who are pretty honest, did he use this kind of terrible language in private? And they said no, they never heard him talk like that. It's possible he was just playing up to Richard Nixon, but it was certainly very disturbing to hear that, and I think it's an indication that he was not as colorblind as he claimed to be, but certainly, whatever he said in private, he certainly had a political record of catering to white fears of civil rights, which I think is certainly one of the things that has to be weighed in the balance in assessing his presidency.
Okay, time for one more question, I think, or maybe 2 more, here and there, and then we're done. Okay? Or you're next, and then you're next. Okay.
Max, you spent a decade writing this book. It's being published 2 months before we go to the polls. How do you want this book to speak into the current moment that we're in?
Well, I mean, it wasn't written to be released in a political season. I mean, again, I started it more than 10 years ago when the only thing anybody knew about Donald Trump was that he hosted this show called The Apprentice. So it wasn't designed to have any kind of political impact, and it's still not. I mean, it was really just designed to provide a balanced and objective overview of Ronald Reagan's life. But I think it's certainly something that can inform the current moment, because obviously Ronald Reagan was a very different Republican president from Donald Trump. And I think the differences are pretty evident and apparent. And I think it's a reminder of how the Republican Party has changed in our lifetimes. And it's maybe perhaps an idea of how it could change again in the future. I mean, the fascinating thing is that, when Ronald Reagan came along, people said that Reagan was moving the Republican Party to the right. But today, if the Republican Party adopted Reaganism, they would be moving to the left. That's how things have changed over the course of the last 40 years.
Final question?
Okay, I'm British, so I'm still catching up with American history. But is it right that Reagan played a role in persuading evangelical Christians to vote Republican?
He certainly Yes, he certainly appealed to evangelical Christians. He worked with the Moral Majority and other groups that were just becoming a political force in the U.S. in the late 70s, early 80s. I mean, Reagan himself was, although he was certainly religious personally, he was not ostentatiously religious. He didn't wear his religion on his sleeve. He didn't go to church very often as president, but he certainly made a very active outreach to white evangelicals, and those formed a big part of his base. And so he came out, after having signed a very liberal abortion law in California. He had regrets about that and came out as an opponent of abortion. But it was always kind of his support for social issues was always kind of carefully balanced. And I talked to one of his aides who said, to Reagan when they were walking out to Marine one day, he said, Mr. President, how come, I know you feel very strongly about abortion. How come you don't do more about that? How come you don't highlight that more as an issue? And Reagan's reply was, well, a president has to pick and choose his battles, and that's, there are other issues that I'm more focused on. And that was, so he never prioritized social issues, but that was certainly part of his coalition.
Well, let me give you one Reagan story to conclude. So Ronald Reagan, as you know, was an actor, but not a leading actor, maybe a B actor they would call him. And toward the end of his acting career, they were trying to get other things for him to do, the Las Vegas act I mentioned earlier. So anyway, he kind of got into politics and so forth. When he became president of the United States, there was an issue that all the Hollywood studios were against. There was something called the FinCEN rule. And so the studios were upset with what the Reagan Federal Communications Commission chairman, Mark Fowler, was trying to do, and was to reverse a rule that was very favorable to the studios. So one day, Reagan is out doing some meetings, and the studio heads had organized a meeting, and they came in at the Oval Office, and they were waiting for Reagan to come back. And so we had, I think, 8 studio heads. All of the most important people in Hollywood are there. And then Reagan comes in the Oval Office, coming back from his meeting, and he sees them all, and he says, wow, if I could have gotten a meeting with any of you, I'd still be in the motion picture business. Okay.
He was one of the wittiest presidents, that is for sure, and spontaneously witty.
Thank you very much for this book, and thank you for being here, and thank you all.
Thank you for this great conversation.